Got it.
Great, thank you, Rowan. Okay, everyone can see my screen? All right. We just did our introductions. So today's webinar, we're going to be reviewing what we've covered so far from webinar number 1. We are going, and then when we dive into the new content, some of your learning objectives, after today, you'll be better able to identify coercive control tactics. You'll be able to define and protect confidentiality and privilege, and understand specifically the role of domestic violence advocates. Since this webinar is for mental health practitioners, theirs will be different. We're going to be speaking to domestic violence and sexual assault advocates. You'll be able to know more about best practices for releases of information for domestic and sexual violence organizations. You'll be better able to have an awareness of how domestic violence interact with mandatory reporting. What are some of the differences with mental health providers and how domestic violence advocates handle that, as well as how domestic violence advocates respond to subpoenas. And we'll have a conversation about what governs that, and then also maybe what you might want to find out about in your own behavioral health center, in your own organization, how you may handle a subpoena, especially if you're working with survivors of domestic and sexual violence. And Vanessa's going to go into talking about safety planning around documentation and how do you document for domestic violence survivors and really answer some of those questions. And then if we have time at the end, we will get into a case review. I have one case review for you today. So any questions, and you feel free to unmute yourself or type it into the chat box. Rowan's helping us monitor the chat box today. Okay, Vanessa, I think this is you.
Awesome. Can you advance the slide? Great. So just a quick recap, and to also see if there were any questions from our last webinar. We talked about prevalence and really looked at how what some of the statistics are around domestic and sexual violence in Oregon. And we talked about also the impact of COVID-19 on survivors within our system. And we also shared some statistics around the COVID-19 pandemic. We defined domestic violence and really talked about how it is defined both in legal terms and then in practice, how we as a coalition define it for the practice that we work. We discussed trauma and we discussed toxic stress. We discussed a little bit about historical trauma and a tiny bit about epigenetics. And we discussed the impact of that on survivors' mental health. And we also provided a really, really brief overview of some of the best practices in domestic and sexual violence intervention with survivors. So those are the things that we chatted about last time. And of course, you can ask me questions now about any of those topics, as well as just throughout. I heard something, Carrie, but I'm not sure what that was. Was that a question?
Somebody just came on with their mic unmuted for a moment.
Ah, thank you. Thanks, Brad. So are there any questions around what we've covered so far? Okay. Thank you, Carrie. That's a brief overview.
I'm gonna let folks know, I know we had a couple more folks join us. And if you can please type into the chat box your name and the organization you're with. I see Rowan asked. I see Diana and Sean have joined us. So thank you. We're just getting going.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about coercive control and specific tactics that perpetrators use. But I wanted, before I kind of launch into tactics, I wanted to remind everyone about the elements of a domestic violence relationship. And the reason I wanted to focus here is that it's quite often folks will confuse relationship tension and violence for domestic violence, and other kinds of just strategies or inappropriate behaviors, and we want to really focus in on what is domestic violence and what are the elements that are involved in this kind of violence. And we talked about power and control, meaning that domestic violence relationships often have a misuse of power or abusive use of power and an abusive need for control, right? And a sense of entitlement to control. So that's one of the elements. Another is that there is a pattern of coercive behaviors, and we're going to drill into those today. And also the element of progression over time, that these tactics and strategies tend to get worse over time. And they also can be really aligned on a continuum, right? So they can be very extreme, or they can be really slight and very pervasive, but they're going to progress over time. And also that the perpetrator's actions are selective. Like, people can do a lot of abusive behavior to their partner within that relationship, but be very charming or very, or even appear to be a very fair and loving, kind, thoughtful person in other relationships and in other roles that they play. And so we talk about that in terms of targeted action or targeted violence or targeted abuse that is focused very specifically on their partner. So the other thing I wanted to chat about is a little bit about the use of language. And because when we talk about perpetrators, which is that's what I'm gonna use the term perpetrators at times. And you might hear me use the term person causing harm. And I'm going to use those interchangeably throughout the presentation, but I want to talk about why we shifted that language. And when we talk about perpetrators, people often feel like that person might be really easy to identify. Like, a perpetrator is going to look a certain way. We have all these constructs and social norms around who is a perpetrator and what a perpetrator should look like. But when we talk about a person causing harm, then we begin to realize that can look like anybody. Many people have caused harm, and so we start to begin to get a more honest lens about who is causing domestic and sexual violence. You notice I just threw a couple images on here. I wasn't really targeting or specific about the images I selected, but I really wanted to impress upon us that this can be anyone. It can be any gender, it can be any ethnicity, any nationality, any ability, any age, that the person causing harm comes in multiple packages. Well, but from the statistics I shared with you last time, that we do have a very gendered, there is a gendered element to domestic violence that is still quite present over time. So we do see that in the statistics. Carrie, is there anything you want to say about the elements of violent relationships or the language that we use before I jump into the coercive control slide?
No, I appreciate that it can look like anyone. And we also know, we often say in our movement that perpetrators or offenders will, they'll pick out folks who are vulnerable or who can be made so. And so sometimes they are in positions of power and they are in positions of prestige in our communities.
Thank you. All right, well, let's dive into some of the strategies that I think would be helpful to know. And I do want to say, oh, there it goes. I do want to say that this is not by any stretch an exhaustive list. But I did pick the things that I hear the most. And I have worked with survivors for over 35 years now and have had them tell me numerous stories. And I am still in private practice doing my clinical work with survivors as well. And so I just kind of pick the ones that I think come up most often to share with you today. And the first one is, the idea of coercion is the use of power and threats and influence, right? So when we talk about coercive tactics, we're really talking about influence, threats, and power used in an abusive way. And one of the most kind of common is this anonymous threats, gaslighting games. And an example of that happened recently to a friend of mine that's a survivor was that the perpetrator took a picture of her license plate and then Snapchatted it. And then when she was like, oh, they sent me a picture of my license plate, they're stalking, they're following me, there was no evidence of the image. It had gone out and then been reclaimed. It was like, what are you talking about? I didn't do that. So this is like this anonymous threatening, or calling your mom and talking to your mom and saying, oh, just having this very subtle and friendly conversation. And then the survivor shows up and mom says, oh, I just talked to so-and-so. They were so charming on the phone. I don't know why I'm so sad that you all are breaking up. Right. And so this is very anonymous. It's threatening. Only the survivor recognizes it as a threat. And so the survivor can appear to be overreacting, blowing things out of proportion, even lying. Survivors are sometimes accused of not telling the truth, when in reality, this tactic of anonymous threat is being used. Carrie, do you have anything to say about that?
I would just say oftentimes also perpetrators will do a variety of things. So it might be, so that's where you go back to that pattern, right? So there might be doing different ways of this. And so it feels like it was only once, but there's a pattern that's happening that the survivor can recognize.
Thank you. Yeah, it's never one anonymous threat. It's a constant anonymous threat. And I used examples that were really recent, but I could write a book of lists of these things, and they can be really, really subtle things, leaving flowers on your desk, helping the neighbor out next door and being outside washing the neighbor's car when you are just getting home from work. And that would be ridiculous to anyone else. Nobody's going to see that as a threat, but the survivor's like, oh my God, they were washing the neighbor's car. Both the perpetrator and the survivor know very well that it was a threat, but it's an anonymous threat, something only the two of them recognize. They turn intimately positive things into threats. Yes, thank you. So another one is surveillance. And this is an interesting one because surveillance, and Carrie's going to talk about technology, but technology has just really expanded the use of surveillance in domestic violence, and particularly in coercive control. And this is the idea of just really, I am always watching. You're coming out of the grocery store, you're halfway home, and you think you see the perpetrator's car. They're following you, or you're at the park with the kids, and you see the perpetrator's new girlfriend across the street. This idea of surveillance, just kind of always watching, which again is kind of linked to the gaslighting. But remember, these are the most common tactics that perpetrators use, not the only tactics. Stalking, I think, we all know what that means. That's that elevated surveillance. It's a whole body of work to think about stalking, but stalking is quite common in domestic violence relationships. And it is also one of the lethality factors. It really does, it tells advocates that this is a serious lethality threat, and it ups our safety planning because we realize that there is another layer of risk. And there's specific tactics that we use in safety plan around stalking that we wouldn't use if stalking wasn't part of what was happening. And the micro surveillance is a different kind of surveillance. This is when the perpetrator is surveilling your everyday life. And this is the kind of thing where, how much time it took you to get home from work, how much time you're spending on the phone with friends or family, who you're talking to, what you're wearing, what even as micro as what you're eating and how much food you're eating, or where you're eating, what restaurants you're going to, whether or not you get to go to church on Sunday and what happens at church and who do you talk to at church. I worked with a survivor recently who when at church could not talk to any of the other men at church, right? If somebody came up and said, "Oh, it's so good to see you. How are you and the baby doing?" She would be filled with fear because there was a micro surveillance happening in her relationship where she was going to pay the cost in terms of an argument or even a violent episode, a physically violent episode, because that moment was surveilled. So listening for that tactic of just that surveillance of all those little details. And it's quite common, the one about how much time it takes you to get home from places. I don't think I've met a survivor where that wasn't part of the tactic for some reason. I think we're all familiar with degradation and shaming, but what I'll say in domestic violence relationships, and specifically as a coercive control tactic, this is specifically targeting survivors where they're most vulnerable. This domestic violence happens in intimate relationships. So oftentimes the perpetrator will have intimate information about where a survivor is vulnerable to shame and vulnerable to feelings of worthlessness, and will then use those vulnerabilities and that intimacy to control and gain power. If a survivor is feeling particularly vulnerable around their parenting, then the perpetrator will assault parenting tactics and create a lot of shame around it. You're a terrible parent. You're a horrible father. You're a drunk like your dad was, or you're a horrible wife or mother. You're mentally ill like your mom was. And so that kind of degradation and shaming that is also very intimate and can feel very true to the survivor and it be extremely destabilizing. Isolation from friends and family. I think we've talked a lot about that. Isolation from helpers. I think this is one that we often as helpers don't realize is such a powerful tactic, where the survivor, it takes great courage to reach out for help. And often it takes, the perpetrator will use that reaching out for help, like trying to call a counselor or a hotline or tell a teacher or even tell a clergy person that they're going through this struggle. The perpetrator will use that against them. So just, being aware that that is one of the tactics and being prepared to have that conversation with survivors to help mitigate that risk for them. And then that micromanagement of everyday life. I talked about that with the micro surveillance, but it can also be more detailed where the perpetrator is selecting the clothing, selecting the friends, selecting the food, picking the survivor up instead of micromanaging or surveilling the time, but actually not allowing the survivor to drive or have a car or even have control over those aspects of their lives, which is a deeper level of control. And then this economy of rules, which is that there's so many rules in the relationship that the rules of the relationship start to become a web of control. And that is just everywhere. And we call that the economy of rules, meaning that the rules are just this pervasive web of rules that the survivor is living by that can make sense to the survivor until they're free of it. And then they look back and say, oh my goodness, I was so thoroughly controlled. And it can take 5 years, 3 to 5 years to really begin to look at these tactics in the way we're talking about them and recognize them for a web of control that really locked the survivor in to the relationship and made it very difficult to identify what was happening because it was this whole construct of behaviors that were happening. So that is a little bit of, Carrie, would you add anything to that?
No, I think you went really through that, but yeah, that the economy of rules might look really different from the outside, but from the inside of the relationship, that there's a lot of rules, and there's no way that survivor. That's the only other thing too. Those rules are set up in a way that there's no way that survivor can ever really follow them.
No,
but that it will be used as an excuse as why the abuse happened, because they should have known and then they broke it, and then that is why they abused. So
yeah, and it really is what sets up that dynamic of power and control. It's like the control are the tactics, and the power is and the violence is used to maintain the tactics of control that are put into place. And so for the survivor, it can feel very difficult to kind of suss out what all this is. But it's important as helpers and supporters that we have the roadmap, right? So that we have the language and the expertise to help identify these patterns and the scholarship to point the way and say, this is actually how violence looks.
I just had one other example for mental health providers. Sometimes one of the recent ones that I was talking with someone I know is they were engaged in marital counseling, trying to make it work. And her partner kept switching. Every time the therapist got to a different level or a little bit level, they probably went through four different therapists at one point, and then realized this isn't about the therapist. This is about not wanting to do the work. And but it took a few years to get there. So
yeah, couples counseling is absolutely counterindicated for domestic violence cases. It is, and there's tons of research to tell us why that doesn't work. So we won't go into it now, but just know that that's the tip of the iceberg of why that's a bad idea. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Any questions for Vanessa before we move on to the next? You can type in the chat box or you can unmute yourself. Okay. Vanessa, are you all right with me moving to the next slide? Okay. Mm-hmm. So now we're going to start to talk a little bit more about privacy and safety best practice. And I know we talked about this a little bit last time, but we're really going to dive deeper into it. So the next slide, you all will remember from the last webinar for those who already viewed webinar 1 and the introduction to domestic violence. But this is really talking about confidentiality and privilege and the difference between them. And so I'm not going to read everything, but we are going to talk more about the federal statute and then the Oregon statute as well. And I want to, as we go into this, remind you of the coercive tactics that Vanessa just dove into and some of the conversations around power and control, and really why our domestic and sexual violence confidentiality and privilege laws are set up at the federal level and the state level the way they are is about safety. It's privacy, but it's safety. Because when you're thinking about stalking and abuse and all those coercive control and those tactics, when you start to talk about privilege and confidentiality, and if that's broken, that's really a safety concern. So it's not only privacy is important, but it's not only privacy, it's also safety. So I'm going to ask you all, why do you think confidentiality is important? So and you can type it into the chat box or unmute yourself, but that legal or ethical requirement that obligates an individual or organization not to disclose the content of what was communicated with them.
It can put somebody in danger.
Put somebody in danger. Thanks, Karen. Anyone else?
Hi, this is Nirmala. It would limit people's trust in engaging in therapy because they would be afraid that, hey, you would like broadcast it to the world if we did not have these legal safeguards.
Yes. So their information gets out there. It ruins their trust. They can't establish that trust. Or if it's broken, they're not going to come back again. Yeah, it can be a big barrier to coming in for services. Samantha typed in the chat box. Yeah, somebody else typed in chat. Trust as well. Sorry. Brad, thank you. And Samantha, the survivors are more likely to come to us for help if they know it is a safe place where they can work out the emotions they are feeling. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you all. So when we talk about confidentiality, there's also some things we want to really think about. Oops. When we're thinking about population-specific privacy concerns, right? Like there's certain communities that may be impacted in different ways if information's out, that they even access your services, that they access the suicide hotline, that they access behavioral health, that they access the domestic and sexual violence hotline. So can you, these are some of those communities that we really think about and train on. We think about immigrant communities, incarcerated survivors, LGBTQ survivors, survivors that experience homelessness or houselessness, survivors living in rural and frontier areas and in tribal communities. Can you all give me some examples about what might be safety or concerns for one or two of these communities? If you want to, you can type in the chat box, but I'll go ahead and give you some examples. Oh, yep, Marcy, thank you. Someone may not be out in their community. Very true. And that could also be an abusive tactic that the abuser is used to threaten to out them. But that can definitely be hard if you're in a smaller community and you're not out in your community. It also can be really...
Nirmala,
yes,
if you're
Nirmala.
living in a rural area, it's very small, generally small, compact communities, who know each other. So that could be a risk that, hey, someone knows what's happening to you if you are not, if you're not protected by privacy laws. And immigrants generally, maybe if you're undocumented, you may have a fear that, you'll be reported. So.
Exactly. For the immigrant community, definitely that is a fear that they'll be deported, that they'll lose their children. For incarcerated survivors, we do a lot of Prison Rape Elimination Act work, and we have folks that work within the Department of Corrections and with the Oregon Youth Authority. And we know that incarcerated survivors don't have any privacy. They really don't in prison have that. The only phone lines, all their phone lines are recorded unless it's with their lawyer, or now that we've got our advocate privilege legislation, then they can have a direct phone line to dedicated sexual assault crisis and domestic violence crisis lines to call without it being recorded. But that can be really hard, especially if something's happening within that prison situation or with someone working for the prison in a position of power. And then some of these communities also that they're already targeted. Their communities are already thought of as other or wrong or to be watched. And so coming out and talking to somebody about this is happening and this, like, do you come and get safety for yourself? But is that going to impact your community in a bad way? Because you're playing into those myths and those stereotypes. And then survivors in tribal communities, definitely, again, tribal communities and rural and frontier areas. How, do you know everybody? Are you going to run into your abuser? Are you going to run into your abuser's mother? Like, are they knowing that you're reaching out, or family members or friends? So yeah, they're going to see you walking into the advocacy center. Are they going to see you walk in to get help and think that you're, let your abuser know what's happening? Anything I'm missing on that one, Vanessa? Or that you?
No, I think that's great. I think I also just would like to add that there's, that when we're thinking about marginalized communities, we're also thinking about communities that are smaller. And so these privacy issues become really important for people of color. It becomes very important for teen survivors. It becomes very important for any survivor where the community can be very small, and then where the community is targeted for social oppression anyway. And particularly young survivors came up for me when I was reading the list, like, working with youth survivors, this comes up a lot. Privacy becomes a huge issue.
Yes, definitely. And for youth survivors also, how do they control their information? They don't, if they're a minor, they don't have a lot of rights. they don't have a lot of control of their life. Their parent does or someone else does. So finding a safe adult to talk about something that they can keep it there to keep them, so, you know, and have some control is really big.
Yeah, finding a confidential support who values and protects their privacy becomes almost critical to them reaching out for help.
All right. So we talked about this a little bit already. We were talking about it enhances survivors' safety, and that we talked about how disclosure can cause escalations of violence. So maybe like they disclose and then it comes back to the abuser, the violence could escalate, or that they walked into the domestic violence advocacy place, somebody saw them. Are you planning on leaving? And then it could reveal this, a disclosure could reveal the safe location of a survivor. So maybe they've already left and somebody says, oh, it comes out in their paperwork, or it comes out in a session or in court that they're what services they've reached out to, or that they haven't, and then they know that they're with a family member or they're at the shelter and maybe they know where that is. It can compromise that survivor's safety plan. So, and that you never know what steps they're taking in that safety plan. Where are they at? Have they had to adjust it? Has it had to shift? So that is something to really keep in mind, how it is so important.
And Carrie, I wanted to just say that I actually had an experience where the violation actually did compromise the survivor's safety plan, and that what happens sometimes, and this, well, you'll probably address this with mandatory reporting, which a mandatory report was made, an investigation was initiated, the investigators got to the survivor's home prior to the survivor being able to implement the safety plan, and it really did put the survivor and their children at great risk. So there is, when confidentiality, even when it's breached in a legal and fair way, we're still needing a safety plan around how that happens.
Yeah, very, very important. And one thing to also remember, and I know we talked about this last time, but the most dangerous time for a survivor is after they leave the relationship. That's where we see the most homicides happen, because that abuser has lost control. Brad, you had a question?
Yes, and I'm sorry, my mind just froze on it. But it was about the potential of the confidentiality being breached, even in a legitimate circumstance. How would I, as an advocate, design a safety plan to address that potential? Two things, obviously, or one other thing that comes into play is the concern that saying to that survivor that potential exists might, in a certain sense, make them feel less trusting as well. I'm sorry if this is off target, but
no, it really isn't. And I mean, the way that the practice I put into place after this incident was when I, as a mandatory reporter, was making that report, I was always doing it in collaboration with the survivor and the investigators, so that we could then really put into place how that investigation was going to happen in a safe way.
as an advocate, though, I probably will never be involved in that side of it, because I'm not a mandatory reporter. And again, I realize this is focused on mental health professionals, so perhaps I should address this in a question elsewhere.
No, what I would say to you as an advocate, because you're working with the survivor, is really talking about the mandatory reporters the survivor's working with, and how they can maintain their confidentiality and privacy safety plan while working with the mandatory reporters in their life. So then they're going to be driving how those reports are made and what kind of safety measures need to be in place. And you can also ask the survivor if they would like you to be involved in those conversations, and they can then invite you into those conversations if they would like to do so.
Thanks, Brad, for those questions. And so confidentiality is also important because we've been talking about safety, but it also preserves the dignity of survivors, and it empowers them to make choices. So it reinforces the principle that survivors control their own personal information. And that is so important for a variety of reasons. And survivors get to decide if, how, and when it will be shared. And so this is really important for domestic and sexual violence advocates and for folks, mental health providers that work with our movement, knowing that this is at the core of a lot of the work we do. This is a core piece of healing. This is a core piece of moving forward with nonviolence and breaking that cycle of violence that may have been in their life. Is really being able, they may never have been able to control their personal information. You know, they may never been able to make decisions, as Vanessa was talking about, those coercive patterns and control that someone has over their life, deciding what they're going to buy at the grocery store, how long they're going to be there, when they're going to get home, you know, all those details. And that it's really important that they get to have that ability to control their personal information and to decide how it's shared, because they are also the ones who have survived, which is why we call them survivors and not victims. The violence so far, they know what's going to happen next because it's happened before. They have that feeling, even if they can't name a concrete reason why, even if it's not going A to B to C, but they're like, this has happened, something, you know, this is a very real and valid fear. So they really need to own their own information. They need to be making those decisions. They need to be with folks making those safety plans, and we need to be listening to them and letting and providing the materials and the tools, but they decide if, how, and when it'll be shared. Okay, other reasons why, because when we're thinking about it, because what happens when they do lose control of their information? It can be used them in a divorce, custody, and child welfare cases, or it can be manipulated by the perpetrator in criminal cases. We see that often. We see well-meaning folks taking lots of notes, documenting things, talking about maybe substance use or depression or the suicidal thoughts or different things. And these things will then come into court and can be really used in their child welfare cases, in their divorce cases, in ways that are really not looking at the full picture. And it feeds back into that fear and into the tools that the abuser has to really undermine them and to further control what's happening and then control the narrative. Brad, it feeds into their belief that they lack power. It can affect a survivor's employment, education, and housing. We definitely know we do have some great laws around housing in Oregon, but we also know that if there's a domestic violence case and the landlord finds out about it, they may not rent to them, or they may ask them to leave because they think there's been that violence is going to follow them to their new location. It's definitely not allowed. It's not legal to do that, but it does happen. We also know that it can affect their employment. If they got a new job and now their abuser's stalking them and harassing them at the new place of work or harassing their coworkers. And then also education, did they start school again, or did they start at a community college or get their GED or a university, and they now know where they're at. And so they may show up on campus. If confidentiality is, or survivors lose control of their information, it can affect their health and or re-traumatize the survivor. And it can affect a survivor's relationships with family, friends, and the community. As we were talking about before, that sometimes perpetrators really can be a trusted member of the community. They might be clergy, they might be the police officer, they might be somebody else. That information gets out and it can, people will make judgments. People might say, no, that could never happen. A survivor really needs to be able to control when they tell their family, their friends, their community, what's happening, or if they tell them. Any questions on this? Or Vanessa, do you have anything to add?
No, Carrie, that was well covered. Thank you.
Okay. Alrighty. All right, we're doing pretty well. I forgot to let you all know, we will give you a break at 2, just a 3-minute one like we did before. to wiggle it out and drink some water. So we'll continue going until about 2 o'clock, and then we'll do a 3-minute break. So next, we did go through this, but I really wanted to let you all know, so Oregon advocate privilege was put into place in 2015 in our state. So we've had advocate privilege and confidentiality in our federal statutes, which we're going to go into for quite some time. But in 2015, we were successful in passing advocate privilege. Every state has it a bit different. So California has advocate privilege. It's much like and licensed social workers, where it sits with the individual. So they go through school, they go through their certification process, and then it sits with the individual. You get, I'm an advocate, I have privilege sits with me. I'm a therapist, my privilege sits with me, lawyer, etc. So that's California. Some of the other states do that. Washington and Oregon are different. And in Oregon specifically, you have to be a employee or volunteer of a qualified victim services program, which every program that is a part of this project is a qualified victim services program. And there's a lot of definition in that, which you can Google the ORS rule. And I can also I'll send out the links to our Oregon Department of Justice Crime Victim Services Division, or CVSSD. We have so many acronyms, sorry, y'all. But I'll send out the link with all the notes and the recording and the handouts for this presentation later, so that you can really dive into it and look, because it can be pretty complicated. So if you all want to dive into it more, but it's important to know that in Oregon, the advocates that you're working with have received at minimum 40 hours of Attorney General approved training, the Oregon's Attorney General approved training, and they are an employee or volunteer of a qualified victim services program. You're not going to be referring to an individual who says, I went through that certification and now I'm an advocate, and they kind of hung out their own private practice. It doesn't work like that. They don't have, those individuals would not have advocate privilege. They need to be an employer or volunteer in addition to this 40 hours training, and then they have added training that goes through in order for that organization to be certified. So the organization is certified, and that's how it works in Oregon. Does anyone have questions around that? Vanessa, did I miss anything, or did you want to add anything to that?
No, that's so clear. Like, I worked on this back in those days.
Yeah. Vanessa's done a lot around this. So, and we work really closely with that. So we provide training, for example, the Coalition and the Attorney General Sexual Assault Task Force. We provide these 40-hour trainings, but we're not the ones certifying. It's actually the Crime Victim Services Division, Survivors and Services Division, CVSSD, of the Oregon Department of Justice. So they're under the Attorney General, and they're the ones who do the formal certification. They're the ones that have all the details and have the checkbox. We provide the training, and then they're the ones where that sits. So if you do have questions, I will make sure about your local provider, or if there's another provider that's approached you, where do they sit in this realm? We can help support, or we can connect you to the folks who would do that. So VAWA, we talk about VAWA a lot. And what is VAWA? It's the Violence Against Women Act. And this is a federal legislation where this all began. It began, the original bill was passed in 1994. It was created the first U.S. federal legislation that acknowledged domestic violence and sexual assault as crimes, and provided federal resources to encourage community coordinated responses to combating violence. So that was really exciting. We've been doing the work for quite some time. It used to be around, in the 70s, around someone's kitchen table. How do we do this? How do we, help our neighbors, help our friends, help our loved ones, help our family escape the violence that's happening and identify it? How do we build this? And so our movement against domestic and sexual violence really began grassroots, and was doing the work for quite some time. And depending on the state, there was some really great legislation, but this was the first time it was federally legislated. And so since it's an enactment, it's been administered by the U.S. Department of Justice and the Health and Human Services, and that dramatically has improved federal, tribal, state, and local response to the crimes. There's definitely room for improvement, we're working on that all the time, but that is what VAWA is. And it's, you'll probably get, if you follow us, our website, or if you're following any of the national news, it is something that we're doing. It comes up every 5 years to be, oh, I just forgot the term. Comes up every 5 years.
Reauthorized.
Thank you. To be reauthorized. And so it's coming up again to be reauthorized. And this really covers a lot of that federal level. And so going into the next thing, that is what dictates our release requirements, our release of information requirements, and talks about best practices around release of information. So that's the part I'm going into next, and why I did a revisit of VAWA. So VAWA is where we get our guidance as domestic and sexual violence advocates in our movement on how to do our releases of information. And also the Oregon statute was written mirroring, I can't say that word, but very similar, almost exactly at the federal legislation's language. So it is important to know that, and that's why I'm pointing this part out to you all today. So our releases of information for domestic and sexual violence advocates may be different than your mental health providers, than your behavioral health clinic. It does need to be written, it needs to be informed, and time limited. What does time limited mean? Does anybody want to say?
Carrie, can I add something here? I think that the biggest difference between VAWA and other kind of release of information you would use as a nurse or a practitioner is that it has a very specific and narrow scope. So you're going, like, it's written, it's informed, it's time limited, specific, and so it's not like the kind of release of information where you're going to release the opportunity to chat with someone. Like, we can share information. It's going to be, I can share this kind of information on this day for this long period. And I think that was what took me as a practitioner. That was the biggest difference for me to grapple with. I wanted to offer that.
Yeah, thanks, Vanessa. Yeah, as Vanessa said, it needs a specific scope, limited circumstances, like, so that it's all outlined in that release of information that their advocates will have. They can't do a blanket release. They can't do like hey, you can talk to anybody who's dealing with my child welfare case, or you can talk to anyone over at Klamath Basin Behavioral Health about what's happening. They can't do that. It has to be specific. It has to be a reasonable duration. And I know this is also another point that's different. Reasonable duration, best practice. What VAWA would like to see, we know it doesn't always happen though, is a week. It can go up to a month, maybe less, but it's back to those safety concerns, right? That could be really hard because you're constantly trying to get those things written, but it's back to those safety considerations about survivors having the ability to own their own personal information, know how to control their story and the narrative, and also know that it might have changed. Something might have changed. They might know that, they might have had to move. They might have had to go to a different shelter. And those releases of information could help an abuser potentially track them. Implications. The survivor needs to know what the implications are. And this I do think is similar to you all as well, but it's something that when we have lawyers train advocates about this, we don't do the in-depth training for the certification. We have some of the best lawyers in the state, in my opinion. I think they're wonderful, do this training. And they really talk a lot about survivors understanding the implications and how important that is. So it doesn't mean I'm saying, don't sign this release of information because A, B, and C can happen. But it does mean, I want to let you know if you're signing a release of information for me to talk to the child welfare worker, they then will have, this information in their file. They may share it in these ways. So just so they're aware of that, they again have that control of their own information, and that it's revocable. A survivor might sign a release of information for a domestic and sexual violence advocate that they're working with. And because it's something that's happened, you've talked to them one day, you called them back and said, okay, it's within a week, or it's within the month, it's within these times. I need to know this and this information. And that advocate may say, they revoked it. I can't tell you anything. So that is a big piece too. It's revocable. It's all around the safety aspect and the survivors being able to control their personal information and safety. Questions or? Vanessa, did you have anything else you wanted to add? Okay. So that is something. So when I always think this is really important, and one of the reasons I wanted to dive more into it today, and I have one more slide and then we'll take a break.
Carrie, Brad had a question I wanted to, just in case
Oh.
you missed it, it's in the chat. He's asking, does the revocation have to be written? And I don't know, I don't think so. Do you know anything about that other than
Yeah,
that?
my understanding is no.
Okay,
They can call you and say, no, you've got to take that out, you know, or they could be in person in front of you, maybe at the shelter. Like, I don't want you talking with my therapist anymore. I don't want you talking to this person anymore. They have too much information and I'm scared. Or, you know, they don't even have to tell you why, but that's what we've heard before.
I have a question.
Yes, Karen.
Is there like a standard template for the release of information form that you ask people that people sign?
We do have, we have a handful of templates that the lawyers that we work with and that CVSSD use and recommend. Yeah. Would you like a copy of those?
I would love a copy of that.
A note.
but there is a reason to create your own as well. I know that Jessie has talked a lot about why she was concerned with creating the templates, that the conversation around building your own is so important for an organization to have.
So they may look a little different. So each of the 7 domestic and sexual violence organizations that are here may look different because they need to build those, as Vanessa said, but they'll have some key components that keep them in line with this. Yeah.
Harry, I think
Some
I
of those
saw
are the
another,
next slide.
I think I saw another chat question, but I don't know. Maybe not.
I see a me too, please.
Me too, please.
For the
Yes.
ROIs, please. That's all I was asking for.
Yeah, so Brad, reach out to Ellen and see what they have, what you all have, but we can share more too. And also our core advocate training is coming up in February of 2021, just because we're recording this. So I want to make sure I put the date in there, February 2021. And, or is it March 20th? I got to look up the date. I don't have it off the top of my head.
It's March. It's March.
March.
It's March. Yeah, it's March.
But Jessie Midland from the Victim Rights Law Center and Deborah Doherty from the Oregon Law Center will be presenting that on this at that training. So they are amazing and will go have so much more details in the legalese.
The only reason I ask is because we're trying to find that balance with the PSU study and how to make that happen. So for the examples that you might have might help us achieve that. I know we have some in-house already. So if I could just be included and when you send those out, that would be appreciated. That's it.
Absolutely. We will make sure. Yeah.
And with the PSU study for this part, you are giving them that information and they are making that choice voluntarily to call and contact PSU. You should not be in the middle of it.
What I understand, I'm sorry. What I understand is, I'm sorry, just give me 1 second if you would, Karen. What I understand is that our mental health provider is going to, they will not have a direct link to PSU. So we have to be the conduit for the diagnostic codes that go from them to us, then to PSU. And that is where our concern is.
Yeah, that's a good one. Okay, we'll work on that with you.
So
Yeah.
one thing that you can do is, so the release of information for PSU is really just the release of their name and contact information, so that we can also contact them directly to invite them to participate in the
Gotcha.
And it's nothing else about them or their situation other than their name and contact information. And anything else they could share with us directly. The thing about the mental health diagnosis that's required for this study is potentially you could have them sign, that could be included in the release of information, or you could potentially use the a release of information form from the mental health agency. So it's quite possible, you know, we talked about the fact that, you know, this grant funds the domestic violence services and not just the mental health services. So it could be that you're serving somebody that has not received a mental health assessment yet,
Right.
or may never, and then we just wouldn't have a mental health diagnosis and we just leave it blank.
Okay.
Thanks, Karen. So the last thing I wanted to review with the VAWA release requirements that impact our releases of information. Did I cut somebody off? Okay. Good. Was these are the things that the domestic and sexual violence advocates are asked to do. So for mental health providers to just know this, and you may do some of this yourself. So they need to discuss why the information might be shared, you know, why I would share it with PSU as part of this, or why I wouldn't. Who would have access to that information? That's part of the, you know, ability for safety planning for that survivor to do their own safety planning and determination of their information. And what information might be shared. And it's really going to be different depending who they're working with, whether it's the suicide hotline, whether it's police, whether it's, and those are all going to be different releases of information. You would never put more than one organization on the same release of information, even if that survivor is wanting you to talk to all these people. It has to be detailed. You're going to agree what information would be shared and with whom. Like, do you want me to talk about what you shared about what's happening with your children with your therapist? And then you're going to agree together and then record the agreement about the scope of the release. So you're going to make sure that that's in writing. So we are at 2:07 now. Thanks. I got a reminder. And I want to make sure that it is hard to do online trainings. I want to make sure to give you a 3-minute break. So at 2:10, we're going to start again. Stand up, wiggle around, use the restroom, grab a glass of water. We'll be back. And we're back. Okay, everybody. There's a little more minute. I hope everybody got to wiggle a bit. So we are going into,
Carrie, I had a follow-up question to the ROI thing. I don't know if it's the time to address it, but I put it in the chat.
mental health agencies and domestic violence advocates who are collaborating on victim services to victims of DV, what should or should not be included in those releases of information? I think that's really decided upon with the survivor. It's going to be different depending on the circumstance, correct? And again, they'll write the details and why. Why do you need this release of information back and forth? They might not need it. It might be that the mental health provider says, here's the contact line, you know, you got into services there, you got into shelter, and they don't necessarily need to know other than what the survivor is telling them about how that experience is going for them there. Yeah, so I think it really it's up to the survivor if they want them to continue to share information back and forth after that initial warm handoff, or they may get a call and they don't want them to talk to the domestic violence organization.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there would ever be a reason that the mental health provider and the domestic violence advocate might want to work collaboratively on the safety plan or the mental health plan.
Yeah, there's definitely advantage to that. If the survivor sees the benefit of that and would like that, I have found that to be incredibly great collaboration. And in some cases, especially when there's significant mental health diagnosis, that can be the best collaboration for the survivor.
Would you have like a sample release of information form that might show the language that might include that?
I will look. I know I've done those before, so I will have to look and see if I can redact one or maybe even use one to create a sample. I will look for that because I've had that relationship before and have done that specific kind of work.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Vanessa. Super helpful. Okay, subpoenas. What now? So I think what's important in the next few slides that I'm going to talk about is what from the domestic and sexual violence organization, what as mental health providers providing and clinical organizations, you know what they're doing. You know what the domestic and sexual violence response will be. And so all of our domestic and sexual violence organizations have a subpoena policy, response policy in place. Who responds, if they challenge it, where those records are, etc. And they have record retention policies. So that's important for you to know. Our organizations have those things in place. They follow those and they make sure that they're in compliance. And that's one of the things that they have to be in compliance with their state funders and their federal funders. So those things are in place. When they do get a court order, and we do get them often, that's what a subpoena is, correct? It's a court order. And we get them from criminal court cases, civil legal cases, divorce cases, child custody cases. They come in a variety of ways. We first go to the victim or the survivor and ask them, do you want us to contest the subpoena? Is this something that you want? Or do you want this information to be there? And even if it's coming from their own lawyer, the organization makes sure that they're asking the survivor. And then they review it carefully. They confirm that it is actually, the source is actually legal and that it is court, that it's not a tactic of the abuser doing something funky or the abuser's lawyer. And then they confirm that the response is compelled. And that's a little more legalese, and I'm not a lawyer, so I can't go into that. But I think it's important to know that this is what the process is for your domestic and sexual violence partner that you're working with. And it's really important to know what your behavioral health clinic's process is going to be on subpoenas. They're going to be different. And it's important that if you're working with domestic violence survivors and you're identifying it, that you know what those responses are. So, and then it's also important to know and remember that we're not lawyers. And so if our domestic and sexual violence organizations get it, they have all these things in place. They have their subpoena response, their record retentions, what they keep in records is going to be different than what you all keep in records. If they keep anything in records, it might just be some basics that they need for grants. But they can't practice law unless they have a lawyer on staff. And so they will consult an attorney if they don't know what the next steps are. And that's what we always recommend to our member programs, is to consult an attorney if a subpoena comes forward and they're not sure what to do. So this is now going to get into mandatory reporting. And I think what's important to know that in the state of Oregon, domestic and sexual violence advocates are not mandatory reporters. And that was brought up a little bit earlier today. And why? So this is the law that you can see here, ORS 419.005. An employee of a public or private organization providing child-related services or activities. And then this is the part that excludes our domestic and sexual violence advocates. So excluding community-based nonprofit organizations whose primary purpose is to provide confidential, direct services to victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, or human trafficking. And so I think that's important because many of Oregon's mandatory reporters, those public and private officials, dentists, school employees, mental health providers, psychologists, social workers, attorneys and counselors, etc. There's many of them. And so we are an excluded group from that. And the reason why.
Carrie, I just want to make sure folks know that not every employee within the DVSA organization will have that excluded, will be excluded from mandatory reporting. So sometimes there is someone like, let's say, who is a minister or a social worker or a therapist, and they're working as an advocate, but their licensure requires them to be a mandatory reporter.
Yes.
So I think it's important as you're working with folks to know that just because you're sitting in front of an advocate doesn't mean you're sitting in front of someone who's not a mandatory reporter. So you'll want to have that conversation.
Yes, yeah. So you'll want to clarify with them if they do have another licensure that would override in our state statute. Yeah. This part of the privilege. Mm-hmm. And that does happen. We have, like, Clackamas Women's Services, who's a part of this project, has mental health counselors on staff. They, of course, their licensure, they are mandatory reporters. And so, or you may, just what Vanessa said. Thanks, Vanessa. So I'm going to get a little bit into why it's written this way. It was written this way in VAWA, and it was written this way when we did this. And some of it's what we hear from survivors when a mandatory report happens. That it made the stalking more active and gave more information to their perpetrator. That mandatory report, that survivors, they lied to them and told them knew that a report was going to be made or would be made. And that their abuser became more abusive, but he just makes sure no one is listening to us, so they won't report again. So maybe that, the neighbor reported or somebody else reported, and they got more tricky around it, made sure. A survivor said they never said another word. Another one stopped going to the doctor's office. So it's hard because that's the reality. And we know that there's a lot of mandatory reporting laws out there. I'm just going to put them up here. I'm sure many of you are familiar with them already as mandatory reporters. But it's important to know what you're reporting, who you're reporting it to, child welfare, police, and what those impacts are.
And safety plan with the survivor. Safety plan with the survivor when you know you're having to make that report. That's a very important part of it.
Very important, yes. And there's been times where, when I did work in shelter for quite some time, there's times when survivors wanted to make that report. And advocates will sit with them as they pick up the phone as support, as they pick up the phone and make that call themselves. And they can, control that information and talk about that. And it can be empowering. It's also terrifying, Are they going to lose their children? Was the report already, did somebody already report it? Does that mean they have to report it again? So there's many questions to it. But I think a big part of this for advocates, and especially domestic and sexual violence advocates, is our role is very different. We're there to walk with them, beside them, and let them know what the services and resources are, and to support them as they make whatever decision it is. We're not there to try the case. We're not the law enforcement is there to do their job. Therapists are there to do their job. Everybody's there to do that. And hopefully our part of it will allow them to talk to us so we can talk about safety planning and the reality of what's happening and how scary that might be, and actually get to the truth of it and give them the options that will best meet their needs. Not that that any advocate's going to ignore something that's been told them. They're just going to try to approach it in a different way. And the idea is that this then allows survivors to build more trust and come in, especially those survivors that have more barriers. Okay, any questions around that? I know that's a lot, and that is a big difference between our two. And please feel free to email me afterwards if you do have more questions as well. Vanessa, I think you're next.
So let's just talk about documentation. And so Carrie, I'm just going to jump right in. I know that time is important.
There we go.
So I'm going to just chat with you about some of the things that I have learned about as I document domestic and sexual violence in my work. And also, I talked with a friend of mine who is a physician's assistant, and I asked her what she thought would be the most important things for you to know in documenting when you're working with a survivor. And she shared some ideas from her practice as well. So that's where this information is coming from. So the first thing was to notice and document affect, right? Is the survivor cautious, shut down, nervous, anxious, checked out, disassociative? Just really noting or making note of what you are noticing about how this person shows up to tell this story. The other one is notice if there's always an accompaniment, right? Is there a child who always has to be with the parent? Is there an adult who's always with the person? Are they being picked up and dropped off by the same person each time? Just really making note of how that person's being accompanied, because that may be helpful later on down the road. Another one is notice the flow of communication. And I specifically checked in with Mari about like, what does that mean? Noticing the flow of communication. And she said, it's like, there's a way that people will be talking about their life story and it's just coming through very fluidly. And then as they start to talk about their relationship, it starts to get a little more halted and a little less specific and a little more guarded. And so noticing that flow of communication is another way of kind of noticing, you're really looking at the whole landscape of how this person's showing up and getting a sense of what's happening here. Noticing medical concerns beyond bruises. As practitioners, we're taught to look for black eyes and bruises and scarves in summer. And, we have these kind of really specific ways we're trained to watch for this, but sometimes it really shows up in terms of hypervigilance around a lot of other issues or lots of medical problems that are layered on top of one another. And just notice those things. We're not jumping to conclusions, but these are the things you're documenting and noticing. And then I wanted to add universal screening to the table. I think that the most important tool we have as practitioners is this universal questioning around domestic and sexual violence before anything else happens, like on our intake documents, in our first conversations, really talking about that we know domestic and sexual violence are prevalent in our culture. We know that they show up. We're ready and prepared to address them. And this universal screening just lets survivors know that you're not afraid of this question. And I point you to Futures Without Violence for information and documentation, tools and resources for doing the universal screening in healthcare settings. And if you want to talk more about that, we can provide you another conversation with some of the futures folks around universal screening. But I am a big advocate for it personally. I think it's an important way to normalize conversations around violence and allow people to feel less marginalized and center the conversation. So that's one thing I wanted to talk about. Carrie, next slide. Oh, Carrie, is there anything you would add to this?
The only thing I would add to that is like if that individual can be on their own. So if that other person's bringing them in for the appointment, can you get them into a room to ask them those questions?
Good point.
Yeah, I had a funny story where I had to bring Vanessa to the emergency room, and they asked Vanessa some questions with me there, and I'm like, how do you know I'm not? Like, you can't assume. You cannot assume
right.
what the relationship is with the other person, right? So I told the nurse that.
Yeah, you did. It was great. She was thrilled to have both of us in the room.
Advocates can be interesting sometimes, but yes.
Okay, thanks, Carrie. Next slide.
Did I get there? Sorry. There we go.
So when you're documenting domestic violence, I think now this is, what we were talking about, the last slide was what are the things you're just looking for in general when you're talking with folks, and how can you best get the information around domestic and sexual violence? This is when you know that it's happening. How do you document an incident that somebody is reporting to you? And so the thing that I think is so important is don't be afraid to get the details. Right? Get as much detail as possible. This can be very, very helpful for the survivor, and then also helpful in your treating the survivor or having that conversation later. And when I say detail, you're looking for frequency, right? How often is this happening? Is this the only incident? What are the other incidents? How did, what else has happened? You're getting like who did it, right? Who exactly it was involved. Sometimes when there's domestic violence, there can also be other perpetrators, right? Family members, or gang affiliation, or there can be other folks. So don't be afraid to ask that question. What exactly happened? Was there a weapon involved? Was something used as a weapon that isn't a traditional weapon? Where did this happen, and who was witnessing this? Were there children witnesses? Were there other adults in the room? Did neighbors come over to the house too, and did they see it? And where did they, what is their information? And the reason we're documenting incidents in this way is that documentation matters greatly in what can be considered a legal document and not. And I'm not gonna, I'm not an attorney, so this isn't legal advice, but as an advocate, we know that the more information that third-party folks have about an incident, when a survivor needs that information, it is very important that you have it, right? So we're not documenting this for us or for our records or for anything like that. This is about how that survivor was brave enough to tell that story. Let's help them only have to tell it once. Right? And let's make sure it is a resource for them if they ever need it. So that, Carrie, is there anything you would add to that?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Next slide.
Yes. So when this is again, part of that universal screening process. And so when we're talking about documentation, we want to talk about full disclosure to survivors about how we're documenting, what we're documenting, why we're documenting. I know Carrie talked about that ahead of time, but I want to just get a little more specific in how you're documenting your notes and what conversations to have prior to that. So the first one is to consider and discuss, and if possible, have a protocol that a survivor can review and sign and reflect upon later of who you're going to share this information with. If you're an organization that staffs cases, tell the survivor about that, right? If you're an organization that is going to collaborate with another organization, disclose that ahead of time and talk about how that information is going to be shared. consider and discuss, are you going to be talking to folks on the phone, or are you going to be sharing electronic notes? Are you using a specific kind of software, and how secure is that software? Like, these conversations can be incredibly liberating for survivors, but it's also so helpful for them to be able to tell you, the information you don't have about their perpetrator. Maybe their perpetrator works for that software company, and you would never know that until you're having that conversation. Consider and discuss the technology safety and the risk. Technology is wonky. There's lots of ways that it can backfire. And one of the ways that I think is most interesting that happened recently is that a friend of mine who's a therapist was working with a survivor, and the survivor was having a session on the computer, and the perpetrator was actually in the room, but the therapist didn't know that, and started talking about an incident of domestic violence, and found out later that the survivor was being surveilled. And so, just in this time of pandemic, really think about the risk of the technology, of using the technology in your documentation. And then also consider and discuss how your records will be kept and accessed. As counselors, I know that about double locking and all of the protocols that we learn in school, but also discussing those protocols with survivors. They don't always know that, right? They don't always know how we're going to protect their records, and how they will have access to their records, because HIPAA does require that survivors have access to records. But one of the things, one of the things you want a safety plan with survivors around is, when a survivor has access to their records, we want to make sure that that survivor isn't being micro surveilled and required to gain access to the records in a way that also puts them at risk. That's why these conversations are so important prior to incident. How will I know? What do you want me to do? Is there a safety word that we're going to use that tells me that I should tell you no, or I should stall getting those records to you? Like, just what should we be doing? And so these are all conversations. I can't give you the list of things you have to do. These are conversations. That's why I say discuss and consider, right? And do that work with the survivors that you work with every patient or client that you come into contact with your coworkers, with the policy and protocol makers in your organization. These conversations should happen at every level. Carrie, is there anything you would add to that?
Yeah, I think the only other thing I would talk about too is we have a link that I'll send you for the NNE, National Network to End Domestic Violence Safety Net project, that does a lot around safety planning. And I think some of that will be appropriate here too, with the more use of telehealth right now, but also talking to the survivors. If maybe they have safety around them and no one's there, but who else is sharing their computer? Is it a shared computer? How do they erase the history on their, that where they've been, so their abuser doesn't come back and check the history and see, where they've been? How do they do that? And then finally, also, we know survivors sometimes have been found due to their health bills. So if they're sharing a health plan, and then those health bills come in, and maybe they haven't said they're going to see a mental health provider, or they haven't shared that, that will come in on health bills and identify an area that they're at, and or who they're receiving services from. And that's a point to discuss with them.
Thank you, Carrie. And what I want to leave you with is, I just went through a ton of information in a very short period of time. And what I want you to hold and carry is that these are conversations to have, right? You don't have to remember all this information. If you can only remember one thing, is that you want to have conversations about safety, access, information sharing, risk factors that every person that you're working with might have in their lives. And so this is just about, how do I have that conversation, and what should I remember to ask about, and what questions, what should I be curious about in terms of keeping every single person I work with safe and protect all of their information. So Carrie, I think that was the last slide in documentation. I know I wanted to do it quickly.
Yep,
And
yep.
so, great.
That's everything. So yeah, that means
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
This is Karen. So I'm wondering if when you're talking about safety plans for doing telehealth with victims of domestic violence, if it would be advisable for mental health agencies to come up with a standard protocol that they share with all of their counseling staff.
Absolutely. That would be so helpful. And I think that in doing that, I think the most helpful way to do that, I don't know how they would do it, but it should be a conversation that they all have, because there's always going to be areas that we don't realize we are challenged by. So sometimes when we give someone a protocol, we're missing some of those specific things that are unique to their organization and unique to their work. But I think having a protocol that is shared and universal is incredibly helpful for survivors.
Yeah, and I don't remember if I might have missed this, if you'd already talked about it, but the idea of the client having a safe word or a phrase during the counseling session. So if they need to, like if the perpetrator comes into the room while they're talking, that they can just get on.
Yeah. My friend who's a therapist, her and I were just chatting about this, and she was like, is there any danger to that? Like, she was like, what are the risks of that? And I said, if you're having that conversation with a survivor, and the survivor, if there's a risk to that, ask that question while you're coming up with the safety plan. You know, while you're having that conversation around safety planning, it's important to say, are we missing anything? Are there risks involved in the safety plan that maybe I'm missing or you're missing? And so, and that seemed to work really well. And the safety word that they're using is working incredibly well. So she's learning that that perpetrator is quite surveillant in his practices, and is often encouraging her to have therapy sessions, but also surveilling those sessions. And so they're coming up with another way to meet, but that would not have been possible without the conversation about a safe word.
Yeah.
And the safe word is, do you want to, you know, I think it was something about getting a drink. Do you want to get a drink?
Okay. Yeah, I was going to ask for examples.
Yeah. Yeah. It was like, should I get a cup of coffee? Should we get some tea? It was something really universal, but it had to be around drinking instead of, do you want a sandwich? Or like that. It was just that specific type of thing.
Right.
Because yeah, so it's really unique, but I encourage the practice, because I've actually, in working with the therapists that I work with, it's actually helping quite a bit.
Great.
Brad, did you have a question? Okay. So the other thing, because I'm in the office, I actually have them handy. We are going to be sending out our updated one soon. Hopefully in the next week. I need to get all the behavioral health updated addresses, but there is a piece around safety planning in it.
Yeah.
I know you can't see that, but I did flip to it just for a thing. And there's a piece also around where there's sample safety plans where people can personalize their own safety plans too. And mental health providers that are on this know that the domestic and sexual violence advocates are trained in this. And so that this is something you can also refer, when you're referring them, you know, do your own safety planning, like what Vanessa and Karen were just talking about. What are those words? How do we make sure our sessions are safe? And that I know if something's changed there, like someone else has come into the room, that you need to identify, that we need to switch conversations. And then also like know that if with that referral to advocates and domestic violence advocates, they know how to safety plan.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah, that's their expertise. Advocates are incredible safety planners. They are trained in it. They are practicing in it. You know, they're our first line of defense in safety planning are our advocates.
Yeah. And one final thing I want to also mention too in this time of telehealth, and it's some of it's privacy, and they're talking about trauma, children in the house, right? So just being aware too that if that it might not be that their child is the dangerous person, but something might have shifted in the room that they can't talk about what's happening because of
That makes
traumatic impact. And one of the things I forgot to bring up when we were talking earlier, Vanessa was talking about sometimes children are coming along. That might be cultural too. It might be that the age of the child, there's no one to leave them with during this COVID time.
And it might be interpretation. So making sure that if you do have someone whose language is other than English, that you can get interpretation for them and that it's not children that are.
It is not best practice for children to be the interpreters for their parents. And it really, I can't stress that enough because it happens. And with all of the resources around interpreters, there's no reason for that.
And that they may have a bilingual, bicultural advocate at your local crisis center, but they should not be their interpreters. They're really their advocate. So I want to make sure that we're clear with those roles. So even though they may be able to speak with them in their native language fluently and back and forth, they're not to be the interpreter for their telehealth or mental health visit. It will compromise the advocate's privilege, and it will compromise also the confidential communications with the telehealth provider. So getting those interpreters in there is important.
What do you think about if you have an ROI between the health provider and the domestic violence program, including the ability to share the domestic violence safety plan with the mental health provider?
Oh, that is a great question.
So they know what to like. I think that would help them to like know what the issues are around if they're doing telehealth or they're doing therapy.
Yeah. I think two things come to mind. I don't think that's a bad idea. I think that safety plans, the best safety plans are not written down. Right. So that's the first thing that comes to mind is a safety plan. And I know there's advocates on the call, so you guys please pipe in as the experts on this. But safety plans should not be written down. The best ones are like conversations and simple things that a survivor can remember that are going to keep them safe. And so I think that it makes sense for the mental health provider to have a conversation that's specific to their role and how to keep that safe. And you know, I think if there needs to be something written down, I think that, you know, that would be a conversation between the advocate and the, oops, I have to pop off really soon, but that's a conversation with the advocate and the mental health professional. And I think if you do have to write something down, let it be a really very few words around, you know, just some very, like capturing the safe word is absolutely a great idea. And just knowing what that word's going to be.
Yeah, and so maybe it's just the mental health advocate as part of what the protocol is for working with domestic violence victims could just ask their client what their domestic violence safety plan is, and so you just
just have a conversation with them and why did you pick those things or what might change, you know, like they can that can be just part of that.
But I would say it was just simply, what do I need to know about your safety plan in order to keep you safe? Right? What do I need to know about it? Right? Because there might be parts of it that the survivor really needs their mental health person to know, and especially around medications. I'm really support when I'm working with a survivor who also has a mental health professional, or maybe I had a survivor who had pancreatic cancer, and medications were greatly used in the abuse. And so we had a safety plan for talking with the doctor. We had a safety plan for the mental health person. And, you know, and so that kind of collaboration can keep someone alive, frankly, when necessary. So I do want to, I get that how important it is, but it's also has to be driven by the survivor. Advocates, is there anything I'm missing in that? I know you all are on there. So is there anything that you would say that I maybe forgot to say about safety planning?
I'm too early in this process to give you any feedback on it, I'm afraid.
Okay.
I am learning, so.
Great. Anybody else? Okay. So maybe I did an okay job. Thanks, Carrie.
Thanks, everybody. Woo. Okay. All right. So we are at 2:47, but I did want to go through a case study with you all so that we had some time around that. And as you listen to this story or this scenario, I'd like you to consider these questions. So what risks can you identify? What barriers to accessing your system can you identify? What do you notice and what comes up for you as you hear this? Because I'm going to read it to you rather than have you read it.
and what resources might help or support this survivor. And you feel free, if you want to share with others in the chat box, you're more than welcome to do that, but you can also just write this down on your own paper, and we can talk about it. Okay, so this is one of the scenarios we use actually in a different training, but I thought that it would work well here. Micah is a 37-year-old transgender Hispanic woman without children. She recently became homeless due to the domestic and sexual abuse she experienced from her longtime live-in partner. Micah has not shared her transgender identity with her partner's family or many of their shared community. She has been estranged from her family of origin for the past 12 years. After working for several months with a local housing advocate, she's referred to a house specifically designed for survivors of domestic violence. She's had interviews with more than 10 houses, and she's talking to you about being reluctantly excited about acceptance to one in a suburban area. So thinking about this and talking about Micah, what are some of those risks that you can identify that may be in place for Micah?
Social isolation.
Brad,
Sorry, I meant to put on my video to get your, but she's very socially isolated.
Yes.
So that's the desire for the urban connection. That's the
Yes,
first thing.
socially isolated, very isolated. Friends and family.
And also like the risk of having like the gender identity sort of exposed to people who have not already been told by her.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Would there be further isolation or challenges rather in the temporary housing for the fact that maybe some of those other people in that housing have issues around her being transgender as well? Because there's the whole bathroom thing seems like, you know, somehow connected in that sense.
Potential. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, potential to have challenges around that with the community in the house, in that housing environment. What barriers about accessing your systems may come up? The systems in your communities for someone who's also Hispanic.
Well, firstly, proper ID, social security number, whether those gender markers or gender identifiers match on their ID, immigration status. There's a lot that plays into that kind of ties into their birth certificate.
Yes, yes.
Yeah,
all
and
of
the legal name that shows up on their documents, the legal name that might show up, especially on even like health insurance papers, might be a different legal name than the one that they go by.
Yes.
Access to things like their hormones and
That's
other
what I was,
things like
Yeah,
that.
medications. Mm-hmm.
Medications.
yeah, that comes up so much with safety planning with trans survivors is access being mobile and moving from area to area can be incredibly risky to their health, because having a good health medical practitioner is critical to safety as well as livelihood and well-being.
You talked about hidden types of abuse, you know, that the victim might like know that it's abuse. And I could imagine that for people who are trans, that there's a lot of different types of sort of under the radar abuse or threats that could happen that other people might not even know are dangerous to that person.
Yeah, and for this particular survivor, they're not, their partner's family did not know their identity, right? So there's probably some things around that.
I think a lot of transgender women find themselves, maybe perhaps men, but I think transgender women find themselves forced into what I want to say, sexual practices. That's not what I mean. Professionalism, basically having to sell themselves as a means of survival. And one of the things I might try to do to help support them is to connect them in with more of an LGBTQ sort of community-based organization that may not be specific around DV, but might help them with those issues specific to their being transgender.
And finding community, right? Like to me, Brad, that a lot of what you're saying is finding community and solidarity and folks who know their lived experience, if that's safe for them, if that's what they'd like. And I do think, yes, we know that for folks of color who are also transgender, the lethality rates are really, really high. And the being targets for homicide and hate crimes is really high too. So being aware of that, those additional factors of violence that may come in from the outside community and not necessarily from the domestic violence. So that when Vanessa was talking with the first webinar around different types of trauma that may be coming in, they may coming in to services to talk about the current domestic violence or the houselessness that they've experienced due to leaving this partner, but that there may be other layers of oppression and the intersectionality that has happened either in their history or in that that they may be at risk for if they're going to be living in a suburban area. That might be one of their concerns.
And one of the things that I think, as Brad was chatting, that came to mind is the economic injustice and the economic oppression that trans survivors are faced with every day is very real and can plunge folks into poverty and houselessness and other kinds of risk. And I think the economic oppression is linked to the high fatality rates. You know, I don't have any like research on that, but just my anecdotal experience working with trans survivors tells me that.
Yeah. And it might be more safe to be in an urban community that might be more expensive for this individual because there's more resources or more groups or, you know, that they would more community they could join. But it's expensive and those economic barriers too. Brad, you already went into some resources that might help with support the survivors. Is there any other things that you all can think of? Especially in rural and frontier, just to note too, there's some wonderful online resources too. Some great ones that are online. Again, safety planning around the technology. But if you're in a community where there's not a lot of resources for the LGBTQ plus community, or maybe their abuser is a part of that community already, and it's no longer safe to access, there might be some things online for them to access as well. So that's always something the good things, technology is good and bad, right? So something to think about, especially during this COVID-19 time. They're not going to necessarily be able to walk into the gender center, the queer center, these great community centers that are set up, but can they find some support online? Okay, so y'all, we're at 2:56. So is there any other questions around the case scenario?
No, I just want to say that you all did a great job of staffing that.
Yes,
That's not an easy one. Thank you.
I know, I threw the hard one out.
You did.
And I want to be thinking about the big picture. The next webinar will be Friday, February 3rd. That'll be our third webinar of the series. And it's going to be from 1 to 3 again. So same time, same place, same bat channel. I will send out the link. I wanted to make sure you all knew that. I wanted to make sure that you had the PSU evaluation for training. Thank you, Rowan. I was just going to ask. Rowan put it in the chat box too. So it's there for you to click on. Please remember that even if you're reviewing this later, you're watching the recording and you're not here live with us, you can still click on that link and you can still fill out the evaluation. And you will be put in a drawing. Each one of these that you take the evaluation, you get put into a drawing to receive a $50 gift card to Amazon, I believe. Right, Karen?
Yes.
Yeah. And that's the evaluation of the webinar. And that really provides us great feedback, great information for this project, for the grant, but also for Vanessa and I as we continue to build and do these trainings to different communities and different professional backgrounds.
Yeah, and please let us know what we're gearing up for the last one. We've covered trauma, we've covered prevalence, we've covered safety, best practices, and now we've covered some safety planning. So let us know what we have not covered. You know, what would you like that last webinar to look like? What have we covered that you'd like us to go more in depth with? Let us know and we will build it out. We probably need to know by Monday or Tuesday what you want in the training if you have that kind of feedback, because we build it out on Wednesdays.
Well, any other questions for us today? We just have 2 minutes left with our time.
It's not really a question. I just want to say that I really appreciate you guys being so welcoming. I feel like I'm getting a lot out of this, and I really feel like you have a really positive presentation approach. It makes it very easy and enjoyable.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brad. It's wonderful to have you all here.
Yeah, we hope sometime soon we can all be in person. Vanessa and I love to train. We've been training together for more than a decade. And
Definitely.
so I miss being in the same room with her. And I would love to be in the same room with you all too. But I'm glad that the experience during this virtual time is working too.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. I'm going to go and chat with my 3 o'clock meeting. It was wonderful to see you. Have a good weekend.
Have a wonderful weekend. I'll be sending out the recording and the links and some other handouts for you, as well as another copy of the presentation, just in case you didn't get the PDF of the PowerPoint before.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.